The greatest player in chess history is back in action. It's always a significant event whenever Magnus Carlsen plays classical chess these days. This is his first classical chess tournament since Norway Chess in May of last year. It's the Tippe Siegerman tournament, which is being played in Malmo in Sweden, and it's an 8-player round-robin event with an interesting field featuring elite players such as Magnus himself, of course, and Liudvik Abdusattorov, Arjun and Johan van Forest. We've also got up-and-coming talents like Andy Woodward and Jegesh Khan Erdemush, and of course a home favourite in Niels Grandelius, and one of the best female players in Zhu Jinier, who's obviously disappointed not to qualify for the World Championship match from the candidates, but now has another opportunity amongst elite company here. Now, in the first round, Magnus Carlsen has white against Arjun Erigaisi. So let's see how things went. So he started with e4, and Arjun responded with e5. So knight f3, of course, was played, and the very solid move knight f6, indicating the Petrov's defense. Now here, white has a few options. You can transpose back into more of a 4 knights game like this, but it's generally considered quite drawish. d4 is quite an interesting option, which leads to some slightly different character of positions than the main move, which was played here, knight takes d5. And black's point is that although we've given up this pawn for the moment, black will win it back quite comfortably. Of course, as everyone should be aware of, knight takes e4 here is not quite so good, although it's still playable, because after the move queen e2, queen e7, queen takes e4, obviously black can't continue the symmetry by taking on e5, so has to give up a pawn here with d6, d4. And this is not, and this is playable, but it's quite rarely seen at grandmaster level. So d6 is the move of choice, and we're going to take on e4 on the next move. So white has again a few different options here, and one of them is the slightly wild taking on f7, giving up a piece for a couple of pawns. The main move is the natural knight f3, but after knight f3, knight takes e4. It's actually been shown in many grandmaster games to be very hard for white to secure an advantage here. Indeed, about 2/3 of games end in a draw from this position, which is noticeably higher than the general average. And so Magnus Carlsen tries this interesting retreat knight d3, which sort of goes against a lot of the principles that you were taught as when you were a beginner at chess, which is it's blocking in this bishop. It's also blocking this d pawn, which makes it quite difficult for white's other pieces to get into the game. But there is a point to this, and the knight is actually looking to go to this f4 square, and then maybe into d5 later. So of course black takes back the pawn, as you would expect, and queen e2. So now there's a concrete threat to play f3. So for example, if black played the move d5, is f3 really a threat because of queen h4? Well, yes it is, because of course the knight's still pinned, so you don't have this typical Pajros tactic by taking on g3 and then on h1. And so black has to do something else about this pin and threat to the knight, and that's move queen e7, which unpins, and Now white plays the move knight f4. By the way, Magnus Carlsen has actually played this in 2 different World Championship matches, including one against Fabiano Caruana and one against Jan Nepomniachtchi. Both of those games were drawn. So now black retreats the knight. This covers the move knight d5, which otherwise would have been quite annoying. And in both of those aforementioned World Championship matches, World Championship match games, Carlsen continued with d4, but here he deviates slightly with knight c3. Again, looking towards the d5 square. As you can see, the queens are going to be exchanged here, so it's going to be a queenless middle game, but with still many pieces on the board. So even though it's a symmetrical structure, there is still some room for play. Okay, so black plays c6, well that covers the d5 square, and Carlsen plays d4 now. Okay, so now if white wanted to, perhaps the move bishop e3 could be played to avoid the queen exchange, so it's a good time to do it. Queen takes c2, bishop takes c2, and bishop f5, attacking the c2 pawn. So black gets his pieces into the game quite nicely. And now bishop d3. So moving the bishop again, but with the clear purpose of exchanging off this bishop. I think in general white would prefer to keep pieces on the board, but this threat to the c2 pawn does have to be dealt with. Another possible move is king d1, but this comes with its own set of slightly awkward connotations, and it would be harder to develop this rook on a1 here. So bishop d3, and again we see that Carlsen's actually made use of this slightly strangely placed knight. It supports this exchange, otherwise he would have had to take back with the pawn, which wouldn't have been so comfortable. And the knight's actually quite well placed here. It looks as though it's being restricted by this pawn, but in a sense the knight is also restricting this pawn from moving forwards, because that would weaken the e5 square most significantly, and then the knight would be very active. And so this will this pawn will remain on d6, and therefore it's slightly harder to develop this bishop. So we'll see how Arjun tries to solve that problem in the game. Knight a6 was played. Slightly awkward looking square for the knight, but there's a potential route back towards the centre via c7 and e6, for example. Now f3, Carlsen controls this knight on f6. It's going to find it a lot harder to move forward now. King d7, king f2, both players get their kings away from the open files so that the rooks can use them later. And now g6. So because this bishop is slightly restricted here, this is how Arjun plans to develop it via the g7 square, where it will exert pressure on this long diagonal, most significantly towards the white pawn on d4. So a4, gaining space on the queen side, bishop g7, and bishop d2. So both players just bring their pieces into the game. And now Arjun also decides to gain some space, the move h5. And knight e2. And here I think Arjun makes a decision that gives him some slight problems. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's an inaccurate move. like an inaccuracy in that sense, but it does leave him having to solve some problems. And it's moved bishop h6. I think this was just a little bit too premature, let's say, trying to exchange off pieces, but doing it in a way that makes his pieces slightly awkward. Carlsen, of course, took this, and that brought the rook to h6. And this isn't such a great square for the rook. It will have to move back eventually. Also, there's an argument that Black's dark squared bishop was actually better than the piece on d2. Of course, having said all this, he does have slightly less space due to the pawn on d4, so in general that's what you're supposed to do, to exchange off pieces to enable your other pieces to have more breathing room. So I would say a slightly controversial decision here, but not one that from which there's which is irrecoverable. The position still is only a tiny bit better for white after this exchange. And Carlsen plays b4, so he's really gaining quite a lot of space now on the queen side, and the move b5 could be threatened to start to undermine this structure. And knight c7, and I think this is a good moment to think about what you might play in this position, how to keep putting the pressure on and make the most of this sort of slight initiative that you've got going here. So well done if you found the move b5, which is what Carlsen played. It looks like this pawn can simply be captured, but after a takes b5 and knight takes b5, white would have the move rook h to b1. And for example, a6 here is not good, because now that the rook's been taken away from the h8 square, rook takes b5 is simply a winning a piece. But even if the rook had been on h8 here and a6 had been played, c4 would have still got through to the pawn on b7, and white would have had quite a significant initiative. So, for example, here knight c7, rook b7, and white is simply a lot better here, with it's probably going to be able to win this a pawn and maintain a very active position. But of course, Arjun doesn't go for this. He plays the move rook h to h8, so reconnects these rooks, and c4. So again, we see this theme of controlling this knight on controlling the knights. So the knight's forward squares b5 and d5 are now controlled, and so that means that the black 6 move becomes a bit more logical, or easy to find. Let's say it's knight e6, so this gets the knight out of this slight bind that it was in. And yeah, the knight's very well placed here, putting pressure on the d4 pawn, so that restricts the movement of white's own knight on e2. Rook a to b1, and this creates the threat of taking on c6, followed by rook b7. Notice that it would be impossible to take with the king due to the fork d5. And c5. And here Magnus has two different ways to respond to this, should we say, threat of taking on d4. He played d5. The computer suggests it might be slightly better to take on c5, but this does exchange another pair of pieces, so you can perhaps understand why he didn't want to go for this just on general grounds. So, for example, knight c5, knight c5, d takes c5, knight c3. And with this d file being opened, it's maybe a little bit easier to get towards the black king. Rook d1 checks could come. It's hard to say if white's really got enough here to start playing for a win, but it would have maybe put a little bit more, put black under a little bit more pressure. Now instead d5, so that gains even more space. But now there are no real sort of natural breaks in the position, so it's a lot harder to take advantage of this extra space. Knight g7 was played. That's a good idea. The knight's going to come into f5 and potentially d4 if that square is no longer guarded by this knight on e2. So Magnus continues to gain space with the move a5, but after rook a8 and a6, black just simply keeps the position on the queen side locked down with b6, and now it's harder to see where white can actually get any advantage, because black has a solid construction on the king side and occupies the open e file. If it was white that was in possession of the e file, then maybe some things could happen, but it's actually quite trivial now, or at least that's how Arjun makes it look, to move the game towards a draw. So knight c3, knight f5, well, that's coming into the d4 square, so black is gaining lots of activity. I was thinking, well, maybe the only plan here would be to try to get into some sort of knight endgame and eventually sacrifice on b6, but the black king is quite close to that, so it doesn't feel very realistic, in all honesty. Rook hg1, and yeah, I liked this maneuver by Arjun. He moves the knight into d4, and after h4 he plays knight c2, so he forces this exchange of rooks, which makes his task a little bit easier, particularly as after rook takes e8 as played, you still can't challenge this rook, so he has to play rook c1 first, and knight went to e3, and that attacks this pawn. Before he went for this, he couldn't have started with knight e3 because that wasn't available, but now after these moves, now he gets to play knight e3 and attack the base of this pawn chain here on c4, and obviously white can't afford to let that go, so knight d1, challenging this knight and also protecting the pawn on c4. Knight f5, g3, defending the h4 pawn. King d8 was played, and now Magnus saw nothing better than to simply repeat the position via knight d1, knight e3, knight d1, knight f5, knight c3, knight e3, and knight b1, just for funsies, I suppose, and knight c3. And so in this position, the position has been repeated 3 times, and so it's a draw. Yeah, so how to sum up this game? I think it was a very solid first classical game back for Magnus Carlsen. I don't think he ever really put serious pressure on. It was just a sort of nagging endgame advantage. And you might say, well, in the past, would he not have won these types of games? Well, possibly, but it was always a very symmetrical structure, and when it became blocked, it was very difficult to make any kind of progress at all. So I wouldn't say that you can really read into too much about his form in classical chess based on this. It might take him a couple of games to sort of get back up to speed. Of course, he is the strong rating favourite for the tournament, as he's been almost every tournament for the last 15 years. So, but will that translate into the victory? We'll have to wait and see. Now, there were a couple of winners today. In fact, Abdusattorov won his game, as did the young American Andy Woodward. So they are half a point ahead of Carlsen at this stage. So it'll be interesting to see how the tournament progresses from here, and whether Magnus can move towards the top end.